A millionaire cruelly abandoned his beloved and their child to be with his mistress. 23 years later, he was paralyzed upon seeing her in a luxury hotel with a young man identical to him. Thomas stood by the window of his lavish penthouse. The shimmering skyline of New York sprawled out before him. He could feel the weight of the decision looming over him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about guilt or second thoughts. No, this was about a better life, one filled with luxury, excitement, and the kind of indulgence he felt he deserved. His wife, Helena, had grown distant, bogged down by their remote life on the farm. She wasn't the vibrant woman he had married. And then there was Lucas, their little boy, with his wide eyes and innocent questions. Thomas couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. His gaze flickered toward Olivia, lounging on the expensive leather sofa. She was everything Helena wasn't: glamorous, lively, unpredictable. Olivia didn't want to talk about mundane things like crops or the weather. She wanted to jet off to exotic places, drink champagne on yachts, and attend exclusive parties. She was freedom wrapped in designer silk. "I can't keep pretending," Thomas muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "You don't have to." Olivia's voice was smooth, dripping with confidence. "Helena is holding you back. You've outgrown that life, Thomas. It's time to move on." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Thomas had spent years trying to convince himself that his marriage would get better, that he could rekindle whatever connection he once had with Helena. But the truth was, he had changed, and so had she. The farm life no longer appealed to him, nor did the quiet simplicity of family dinners or the responsibilities of fatherhood. Thomas turned away from the window, grabbing his suitcase from the corner of the room. It was already packed, a silent testament to his decision. No more delays, no more second thoughts. He had booked the flight to Los Angeles for the following morning, where Olivia had connections that could change everything. They would start fresh, away from the farm, from Helena, and from Lucas. As Thomas zipped up the suitcase, a wave of unease washed over him. For a brief moment, he thought of Helena, standing on the porch of their farmhouse, watching as his car drove away. He imagined Lucas running after the car, calling out for his father. His chest tightened, but he quickly buried the feeling. "It's for the best," he told himself. "I can't live that life anymore." Olivia rose from the couch and glided toward him, her manicured hand sliding over his shoulder. "Don't look back, Thomas. You're doing the right thing." He nodded, though the pit in his stomach remained. The truth was, he hadn't even told Helena. There had been no argument, no confrontation. He'd simply stopped answering her calls, stopped visiting the farm. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid. But she had no idea the decision was already made. Thomas knew Helena was too proud to beg him to stay, but deep down, he also knew she would be heartbroken. He could picture her sitting by the old piano in their living room, fingers hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play the melancholy tune that always reflected her mood when things weren't right. It had been years since she performed, and that passion, the one thing that had connected them in the early days, seemed to have disappeared entirely. Now, it was all about survival on that lonely farm. Olivia's grip tightened, pulling him out of his thoughts. "You've got a plane to catch." Without another word, Thomas grabbed the suitcase, the final act that severed him from his past. He wasn't going to be the man tied to a rural life, surrounded by chores and responsibilities. No more chickens to feed, no more crops to tend, no more dull conversations about the weather. He glanced at Olivia one last time before heading to the door. Her smile was bright, full of promise, but it was nothing compared to the warmth Helena used to give him. Still, it was easier this way. Olivia didn't ask for more than he was willing to give, and that was all he needed. Outside, the city lights reflected in his car's windshield as he sped through the streets, leaving behind the quiet life Helena and Lucas still clung to. The farm was hundreds of miles away, but he could already feel the distance growing in his heart. He imagined the moment when Helena would realize he wasn't coming back, her world crumbling without explanation. But that wasn't his problem anymore. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. Helena stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her gaze lost in the distant horizon where the sky met the rolling fields. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, but she barely noticed. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the silence that had become all too familiar in recent months. The phone calls from Thomas had stopped weeks ago, and despite her attempts to reach him, there was no answer. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't been prepared for the truth that would soon hit her. The door creaked as Lucas came out, holding a small toy truck in his hand. "Mama, when is Daddy coming home?" he asked, his wide, innocent eyes looking up at her with hope. Helena's chest tightened. She bent down and brushed his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetie," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince more, Lucas or herself. Every day that passed without word from Thomas felt like another step deeper into a reality she didn't want to face. It had been clear for a long time that their marriage wasn't what it used to be. But Helena had held on to the hope that they could find a way back to each other. She had given up so much for him, her career, her dreams of becoming a renowned pianist. She had traded the stage for a life in the country, raising their son and managing the farm while Thomas pursued his business ventures. But now, the silence was deafening. Helena stood up and took a deep breath, forcing herself to look at the world around her. The farm was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. It had always been a place of peace, but lately, it felt like a prison. She could feel the weight of the responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders, the bills, the upkeep, and the constant worry about how she would manage everything on her own. If Thomas wasn't coming back, how would they survive? As she walked inside, Lucas followed closely behind, tugging at her sleeve. "Can we have pancakes for dinner?" Helena smiled faintly. "Sure, pancakes sound perfect," she replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. Lucas deserved more than the sadness she was carrying. He was just a child, and she needed to shield him from the truth for as long as she could. The kitchen was small, but cozy, filled with the remnants of the life they had once built together. Helena pulled out the ingredients for pancakes, her mind wandering as she measured flour and cracked eggs. She remembered the early days when she and Thomas had first moved to the farm. They had been full of excitement, eager to start a family and build something meaningful together. The farm had been their dream. Thomas had talked about raising their children in nature, away from the chaos of city life. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Helena shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. Dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. She needed to focus on the present, on making sure Lucas was fed and happy. That was all that mattered right now. As they sat down to eat, Helena forced herself to engage in light conversation with Lucas, asking about his day and listening to him talk about the toy cars he had been playing with. He was so full of energy and life, unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's heart. Helena envied his innocence, the way he still believed that everything would be okay. But as the night crept in, and Lucas drifted off to sleep, Helena found herself alone with her thoughts once again. She sat by the window, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The farm was quiet, and in that silence, the truth began to settle in her bones. Thomas wasn't coming back. She hadn't received any official word from him, but in her heart, she knew it was over. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time since Thomas's disappearance, she allowed herself to cry. She had been strong for Lucas, holding everything together. But now, in the solitude of the night, she let the weight of it all crush her. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had abandoned them. The life they had built was nothing more than a memory, and she was left to pick up the pieces. After what felt like hours, Helena wiped her eyes and stood up. There was no point in wallowing in sorrow. She had a son to take care of, a farm to run. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Slowly, she began to steel herself for the reality ahead. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to keep the farm going. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to support Lucas. Tomorrow, she would have to learn how to be both mother and father. It wouldn't be easy, but she had no choice. She had to survive. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the fields as Helena struggled to move a heavy sack of feed toward the barn. Her muscles ached, her body unused to the kind of labor that running a farm demanded. The isolation of it all weighed heavily on her, but she refused to give up. Lucas still slept inside the house, and the last thing she wanted was for him to see her struggling. She wanted him to feel safe, to believe that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. As Helena reached the barn door, she heard the sound of a truck rumbling down the dirt road. It was an unusual sound. Visitors were rare in this part of the countryside. She turned her head, wiping the sweat from her brow, and watched as an old, beat-up pickup truck came to a stop near the house. Out stepped a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with sun-kissed skin and a calm expression. He wore a well-worn hat, boots caked with dirt, and jeans that had seen better days. Helena's guard went up immediately. She wasn't used to strangers coming around, especially not since Thomas had left. The man walked toward her, tipping his hat as he approached. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a deep, steady voice. "Name's Mark. I live a few miles down the road. Heard you could use a hand around here." Helena hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't one to accept charity, and she certainly wasn't comfortable with the idea of letting a stranger into her life. But the truth was, she did need help. The farm was too much for one person, and with Thomas gone, she had no one to turn to. I don't think we need any help," she replied, her voice a little shaky. "But thanks for the offer." Mark didn't budge. He just stood there, his eyes kind but unwavering. "I've seen you working the fields," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a tough job for anyone, let alone someone trying to do it all alone. I've been a farmer my whole life, and I know how it is." Helena bit her lip, glancing at the sack of feed she had just dropped. She was tired, exhausted, really, and the idea of having help, even for a little while, was tempting. But she wasn't sure she could trust this man. Still, something about his demeanor put her at ease. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a genuine willingness to lend a hand. "I guess I could use some help with the heavier work," she admitted, her pride taking a small hit. Mark nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I'm not here to get in your way, ma'am. Just thought I could make things a little easier for you." Helena let out a sigh and gestured toward the barn. "Well, if you're offering, I could use a hand moving that sack of feed inside." Without another word, Mark rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved the heavy bag with ease, his strength evident as he carried it into the barn. Helena watched him, her initial skepticism fading. He wasn't just offering help, he was genuinely capable. She couldn't deny that it was a relief to have someone else take on some of the burden. As the morning went on, Mark continued to assist with the farm work. He repaired a broken fence, helped organize the barn, and even managed to get an old tractor running again. Helena was amazed by how much they had accomplished in just a few hours, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. Over lunch, they sat together at the small wooden table inside the house. Lucas, now awake and full of energy, babbled on about his toy trucks as Helena served them sandwiches. Mark listened patiently, nodding and smiling at Lucas's excitement. Helena couldn't help but notice how natural Mark seemed around her son, how at ease he was in their home. "You've been a big help today," Helena said as they ate, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." Mark shrugged modestly. "Just glad I could help. I've been in your shoes before. Lost my wife a few years back. Things were tough for a while. I know how it feels to try to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Helena looked down at her plate. feeling a pang of empathy for this man she barely knew. She could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just being polite. He had lived through his own hardships, just like she was now. Maybe that's why he had shown up today. Maybe he understood her struggle better than she realized. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "It's hard, doing all this alone." Mark gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "It doesn't have to be that way, Helena. Sometimes it's okay to let people in. You don't have to do it all on your own." His words struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had been trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together for Lucas. But maybe Mark was right. Maybe she didn't have to carry this burden alone. As the afternoon stretched on, Helena found herself opening up more to Mark, sharing bits and pieces of her life on the farm, her love for music, and the dreams she once had of being a concert pianist. He listened without interrupting, and by the time he left that evening, Helena felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Mark's arrival had been unexpected, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she needed. The days following Mark's arrival passed in a blur of work. But for the first time in a long while, Helena didn't feel as though she was drowning. With Mark's help, the farm began to run more smoothly. The fences were mended, the crops tended to, and the weight that had been pressing down on Helena's shoulders seemed to lift, if only just a little. Lucas, too, seemed to have grown fond of Mark. He followed him around like a shadow, asking questions about tractors, animals, and anything else that sparked his young mind. One afternoon, after finishing up with the day's chores, Helena found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. Mark had gone back to his own farm for the evening, leaving her with some rare quiet time. Inside the house, Lucas was playing with his toy trucks, his happy chatter filling the air. Helena closed her eyes, letting the peacefulness wash over her. And then, almost unconsciously, her mind drifted to the piano, the one she hadn't touched in years. It sat there, in the living room, gathering dust, the same piano that had once been the center of her life, the instrument that had carried her through her teenage years, her college days, and the first years of her marriage. Back then, music had been everything to her. She had spent hours practicing, dreaming of the day she would perform on grand stages in front of large audiences. But those dreams had faded when she married Thomas, and they had vanished completely when they moved to the farm. The piano became more of a relic from a past life, something she didn't dare touch, as if playing it again would remind her of all the things she had lost. But now, with the farm finally running smoothly and Lucas happy, something inside her shifted. The thought of playing again didn't seem so far-fetched. In fact, it felt almost necessary. She stood up, walking back inside the house. Lucas barely noticed as she moved past him toward the corner of the living room where the piano stood. Helena hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the worn, familiar keys. Could she really do this? Could she rediscover that part of herself? She took a deep breath, letting her fingers press down on the keys. The sound that filled the room was soft, almost hesitant at first, but it stirred something deep within her. The melody, one she had memorized years ago, came back slowly, as though her hands remembered even if her mind had forgotten. The notes flowed from the piano, filling the house with music that hadn't been heard in far too long. As she played, memories of her old life, before the farm, before Thomas, before everything, came rushing back. There had been so much hope, so much passion in those days. And even though life had taken a different path, playing the piano again felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Lucas wandered into the living room, his toy truck still in hand, and stood quietly by her side, watching in awe as his mother played. Helena glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to joy. "Wow, Mama," Lucas whispered, his eyes wide. "You're really good." Helena chuckled softly, her fingers never stopping their dance across the keys. "I used to play a lot when I was younger," she explained. "It's been a long time." "Why did you stop?" Lucas asked, his innocent question hanging in the air. Helena's smile faltered for just a moment. She had stopped for so many reasons: Thomas, the move, the responsibilities of raising a family. But how could she explain all of that to her little boy? "I guess life got busy," she said gently. "But maybe it's time I start again." As the days passed, Helena made a point to sit at the piano more often, sometimes playing for hours after Lucas went to bed. The more she played, the more her love for music came rushing back. It wasn't long before Mark noticed the change in her. One evening, after dinner, Helena was at the piano again when Mark knocked on the door. Lucas, thrilled to see him, ran to let him in. Mark stepped inside, his eyes catching sight of Helena at the piano. "I didn't know you played," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Helena stopped, a little self-conscious now that she had an audience. "I used to, a long time ago. I guess I'm just rediscovering it." Mark smiled, that easygoing smile of his. "You're good. Really good." Helena blushed slightly, not used to receiving compliments anymore, especially about something that had once been such a private passion. "Thanks," she muttered, her fingers lingering on the keys. "You ever think about playing for other people, like you used to?" Mark asked, his tone casual but curious. Helena let out a small laugh. "Oh, I don't know about that. I think those days are behind me." "Why? You've got talent, Helena. People should hear you play." The thought of performing again had crossed her mind, but it seemed like such a distant possibility. There were bills to pay, a farm to run, a child to raise. But as she sat there, her fingers tracing the smooth ivory keys, she realized that maybe it wasn't as impossible as she thought. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, not wanting to make any promises, but feeling a glimmer of hope nonetheless. Mark nodded, understanding that it wasn't something she could decide on the spot. But the seed had been planted. Helena felt it, too. A small spark of ambition that had been buried for far too long. As the evening wore on, Mark stayed for a while longer, helping Lucas with his homework and chatting with Helena about farm work. But even after he left, the piano remained at the forefront of her mind. Helena sat at the piano again after Lucas went to bed, this time letting the music flow freely. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for her future. The city lights of New York stretched far and wide, but for Thomas, they no longer sparkled with the same allure. He sat slumped at the corner table of a dimly lit bar, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in front of him. The days of lavish parties, extravagant dinners, and VIP treatment were long gone. It had been months since Olivia had walked out on him, leaving him to face the mounting debts, lawsuits, and failed business ventures that were rapidly consuming everything he had built. Thomas rubbed his temples, trying to block out the reality that had become his life. He had lost it all. The company he had once proudly helmed, the real estate empire that had made him one of New York's most admired businessmen, was gone. He had made bad deals, risky investments that didn't pay off, and Olivia, ever the opportunist, had left the moment the money stopped flowing. She hadn't even bothered with a proper goodbye, just packed her bags and vanished. The truth was, he had seen it coming. There had been signs: her growing disinterest, the late-night phone calls, the subtle hints that she was looking for something else, someone else. But Thomas had chosen to ignore them, just like he had ignored Helena's calls when he left her behind on the farm. The bartender, a middle-aged man who had seen one too many customers drown their sorrows at his counter, came over and eyed Thomas with mild sympathy. "You need a refill?" he asked. Thomas shook his head, pushing the glass away. "No, I'm good," he mumbled, though nothing about his situation felt good. He stood up from the bar and tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter, enough to cover his tab. As he made his way to the exit, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The city was loud and vibrant, as it always was, but to Thomas it felt distant, like he no longer belonged there. He had never imagined his life would come to this. A year ago, he had been on top of the world, rich, admired, and with a beautiful woman on his arm. But all of it had been built on lies, deception, and the shallow pursuit of wealth. The empire he had once been so proud of had collapsed in a matter of months. His bank accounts were frozen, his properties seized, and his name dragged through the mud in the press. The final blow had come just a few weeks ago, when he had been forced to sell the last of his assets. The only thing left was his apartment, and even that was barely hanging on by a thread. The creditors were closing in, and soon he would be left with nothing but his reputation, one that had been shattered beyond repair. As Thomas walked through the crowded streets, his mind wandered back to the farm, back to Helena and Lucas. He hadn't thought about them in so long, but now, in the middle of his downfall, they seemed to haunt his every waking moment. What had they done to deserve his abandonment? Helena had been nothing but supportive, even when he had decided to chase after Olivia and leave them both behind. And Lucas. Thomas couldn't even remember the last time he had seen his son. The boy had probably grown so much by now, but Thomas had missed it all. He had missed birthdays, milestones, everything. All for what? For a life of luxury that had proven to be nothing more than an illusion. His feet carried him aimlessly until he found himself standing outside a gleaming hotel. It was one of the high-end places he used to frequent, back when money was no object and everything seemed possible. But now, the sight of it only filled him with shame. He had applied for a job there just the other day, not as a guest, but as a janitor. Thomas glanced through the glass doors of the hotel, catching a glimpse of the polished marble floors and sparkling chandeliers inside. He had walked those very floors in designer suits, brushing shoulders with the elite, confident and powerful. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow of the man he used to be. The interview had been humiliating. Sitting in a tiny office, dressed in clothes that no longer fit quite right. He had filled out the application, barely able to meet the eyes of the young hotel manager who interviewed him. The manager had looked him over, clearly skeptical that a man like Thomas would be willing to mop floors and scrub toilets for a living. But Thomas didn't have a choice. He needed the money. There was nowhere else to turn. The job had been offered to him on the spot. The pay was minimal, but it was something. It was enough to keep him afloat, at least for now. Tomorrow would be his first shift. Tomorrow, he would step into a life he had never imagined for himself. Thomas took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. This was the consequence of his choices. The women he had pursued, the deals he had made, the family he had abandoned. It was all catching up to him now, and there was no escaping it. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the hotel for his first day of work. The uniform they gave him felt foreign on his skin, a far cry from the tailored suits he once wore. He kept his head down, avoiding the eyes of the hotel staff as he grabbed the cleaning supplies and set off to start his shift. As he scrubbed the floors, the reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. This was his life now. No more parties, no more lavish dinners. Just him, a mop, and the echoes of his past mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Something that could teach him the lessons he had so desperately needed to learn. Helena sat at her piano, her fingers flowing effortlessly across the keys as the music filled the room. The soft light of the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the small concert hall where she was rehearsing. It had been years since she had felt this alive, this connected to her true self. The melodies she played seemed to carry her beyond the weight of her responsibilities, lifting her above the hardships she had faced. She had come so far since those dark days on the farm when the weight of Thomas's abandonment had crushed her spirit. Now, instead of struggling to survive, she was thriving. Her name was known, her music celebrated in local circles, and invitations to play at events and small concerts had started to pour in. The community had embraced her talent, and with each performance, Helena found herself rediscovering the passion that had once defined her. Her success had been gradual, but steady, thanks in no small part to Mark. He had encouraged her every step of the way, always reminding her of the gift she had buried for so long. He had taken on more of the farm work, giving Helena the freedom to focus on her music again. And Lucas, who was now in school, was thriving as well. Their life had become one of balance and joy, a far cry from the lonely struggle Helena had faced alone. After her rehearsal, Helena stepped off the stage, taking a moment to absorb the feeling of accomplishment. She had a performance that evening, and she could already feel the anticipation building. It wasn't the grand stage she had once dreamed of, but it was a start, and the most important thing was that she was doing what she loved, for herself, for Lucas, and for Mark. Mark had been more than a support. In the years since he had entered her life, he had become her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had built something beautiful, a family, a home, and now a future. It wasn't the life she had originally envisioned for herself, but in many ways, it was better. There was love, stability, and a shared purpose that filled every day with meaning. As Helena gathered her things to head home, she caught sight of Lucas in the hallway, holding Mark's hand as they approached. Her heart swelled at the sight of them, a reminder of the life they had built together. Lucas had grown so much, and he adored Mark, looking up to him as a father figure. It was a bond that filled Helena with gratitude every day. "Mama!" Lucas ran toward her, his face lighting up with excitement. "Are you ready for tonight? I told all my friends at school about your concert." Helena laughed, bending down to give him a hug. "I'm ready, sweetheart, and I'm glad you're so excited." Mark smiled, his eyes warm as he watched the exchange. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, stepping closer to wrap his arm around Helena's shoulders. "You're going to be amazing." Helena leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence. "Thanks to you," she said softly. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Mark shook his head, his smile widening. "You've always had this in you, Helena. I just gave you a little push." It was true. Mark had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. He had been there, day after day, helping her rediscover the part of her that had been buried for so long. And now, as she prepared for yet another performance, Helena felt more alive than she had in years. Later that evening, as the concert hall filled with the quiet murmur of the audience, Helena stood backstage, nerves fluttering in her stomach. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was her moment. She had worked hard to get here, and no matter what happened, she had already won. She had reclaimed her music, her passion, and her life. The lights dimmed, and the announcer's voice echoed through the hall, introducing her to the waiting crowd. Helena stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, all the nervousness melted away. The music took over, flowing from her fingertips with a grace and ease that felt like coming home. The audience was silent, captivated by the beauty of her performance. Helena's eyes remained closed as she played, losing herself in the music. This was where she belonged, and she knew it now more than ever. The years of hardship, the sacrifices she had made, all of it had led her to this moment. And as she played the final notes, a wave of emotion washed over her. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Helena stood and bowed, her heart swelling with gratitude. In the front row, she spotted Mark and Lucas, their faces beaming with pride. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. After the concert, as the audience filtered out and the stagehands began to clear the space, Helena found herself surrounded by well-wishers. People congratulated her, praising her talent and the beauty of her performance. It was a humbling experience, one that made her realize just how far she had come. But amid the celebration, it was Mark and Lucas who stood out the most. They were her family, the ones who had been there through it all. Mark wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice filled with admiration. Helena smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." Later that night, As they drove back to the farm, Helena looked out at the darkened fields, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had built a new life, one that was filled with love, music, and the promise of a future she had once thought impossible. And as they pulled into the driveway, Helena realized that for the first time in a long time, she was truly happy. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow as he pushed the mop across the hotel lobby floor, the once polished marble now a sea of dirty footprints left by guests bustling in and out. He hated this job. Every swipe of the mop reminded him of the life he'd lost, the wealth, the power, the sense of importance. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, forgotten and overlooked. The hotel's grandeur mocked him. The chandeliers above sparkled like the life he once lived, so close yet utterly out of reach. Each day was a grim reminder of the choices that had led him here. He had traded his family for Olivia, for what he thought was a better life, and it had all crumbled. He hadn't seen or heard from Helena in years, and he tried not to think about Lucas, the son he had abandoned. Guilt gnawed at him, but there was no going back now. All he could do was keep his head down and get through the day. The lobby was busy with guests checking in, couples heading to dinner, and families preparing for a night out in the city. Thomas kept to himself, avoiding eye contact, blending into the background like the furniture. His life had become a routine of mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and taking out trash. It was humiliating, but it was all he had. As he rounded the corner, pushing his cleaning cart along with him, he glanced up and froze in place. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Standing at the far end of the lobby, looking radiant and poised, was Helena. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas stared, unable to process what he was seeing. She was older, of course, but the years had been kind to her. She stood there, gracefully holding the hand of a man who was clearly not Thomas. Next to them was a young boy, not much younger than Lucas had been the last time Thomas had seen him. And then, as his eyes shifted, they landed on a young man, tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence. His heart clenched painfully as he realized it was Lucas. They were all together, Helena, Lucas, and the man Thomas didn't know, the man who must have replaced him. The mop slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of regret. He had never imagined he would see them again, especially not like this. Happy, successful, without him. Helena didn't notice him at first. She was busy checking in at the front desk, laughing softly with Lucas and the man by her side. But then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes met his. And for a split second, neither of them moved. The recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by a mix of surprise and something else. Pity, maybe. Thomas's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came out. The years of silence, of running away from his mistakes, had caught up with him in this single moment, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of his failures. Helena's gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer before she looked away, turning back to Lucas and the man. She didn't rush to confront him, didn't make a scene. Instead, she carried on with her conversation, as if he were nothing more than a stranger passing by. But to Thomas, it felt like a punch to the gut. He stood there, rooted in place, watching as Helena and her new family moved toward the elevators. Lucas glanced back briefly, his eyes brushing over Thomas without a hint of recognition. It was as if he didn't even remember his own father. And why would he? Thomas had been gone for so long, leaving nothing but an empty space in Lucas's life. The elevator doors slid shut, and just like that, they were gone. Thomas stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Helena looked happy. Happier than he had ever seen her when they were together. The man by her side, with his arm around her, clearly loved her. They had a family now, one that didn't include him. The pain hit him harder than he expected. He had always known that Helena would move on, that she would find someone better than him. But seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. He had never felt more alone, more worthless, than in that moment. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "Hey, are you going to finish cleaning or just stand there?" Thomas blinked and turned to see the hotel manager staring at him with an annoyed expression. Without another word, he picked up the mop and continued working, though his hands trembled and his mind was far away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Thomas went through the motions, cleaning, scrubbing, doing what was expected of him. But his mind was elsewhere. Back with Helena, back with Lucas, back to the life he had thrown away. He had no idea what to do next, no idea if he should even try to reach out to her. What could he possibly say after all these years, after all the pain he had caused? As he clocked out and walked back to his small, dingy apartment that night, the image of Helena and her new family haunted him. He had missed so much. Lucas growing up, the life they had built without him. And now, seeing them happy, successful, and complete without him only magnified the emptiness he felt inside. Thomas knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The life he had destroyed could never be rebuilt, but for the first time, he wondered if there was still a chance, however small, for redemption. Maybe, just maybe, he could make things right, even if he could never truly be part of their lives again. Thomas barely slept that night, his mind consumed by the image of Helena and Lucas. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. For years, he had pushed thoughts of his old life away, burying them under the weight of his ambition and greed. But now, after seeing them so unexpectedly, it was all he could think about. By the time the sun began to rise, Thomas had made up his mind. He had to speak to Helena. He couldn't go on like this, living with the regret, the guilt, the what-ifs. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he had to try. He had to face the consequences of his choices, no matter how painful. The next day, Thomas returned to the hotel, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't worked up the courage to ask around about Helena's room number, so he waited in the lobby, pacing nervously near the elevators. Each time the doors opened, he held his breath, hoping it would be her. Hours passed, and doubt began to creep in. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had already left, taking her new life with her and leaving him behind once again? The thought made his stomach churn, but he refused to leave. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the elevator doors opened, and there she was. Helena stepped out, looking radiant as ever, though the weight of their shared history hung between them like a thick fog. She paused when she saw him standing there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension thick in the air. "Helena," Thomas finally said, his voice shaky and low. "Can we talk?" She didn't respond right away, her eyes studying him with a mixture of surprise and caution. Thomas could see the wariness in her gaze, the hesitation, the memories of all he had done to her. "Please," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to talk to you." Helena let out a slow breath, her expression softening slightly. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's talk." They stepped outside the hotel, the cool autumn air brushing against their skin. They found a small bench in a nearby park, away from the bustle of the city. Thomas sat down first, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Helena sat beside him, but there was a distance between them that felt like a chasm. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Thomas struggled to find the words, unsure of where to even begin. How could he explain himself? How could he possibly make up for everything he had done? I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Helena, I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving you, for abandoning Lucas. His words caught in his throat, and he swallowed hard. I was selfish. I was a coward. Helena didn't respond right away. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, listening as Thomas poured his heart out. I thought I wanted something more, he continued, his voice trembling. I thought the money, the luxury, all of it would make me happy. But it didn't. It ruined everything. I lost everything. And now I see you, and you've built this incredible life without me. I don't blame you for moving on, for finding happiness. But I can't stop thinking about what I threw away. Helena finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Thomas, it wasn't just about the money. You left because you wanted a different life, and that's fine. But you didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from Lucas, too. Thomas winced at the mention of his son. It was the deepest wound, the one that hurt the most. He had abandoned Lucas, left him without a father, all because of his own greed. I know, he whispered. I know I don't deserve his forgiveness, or yours. But I'm asking you anyway. Not to forget what I did, but to at least forgive me. Helena's gaze softened, her eyes reflecting a sadness that mirrored his own. Thomas, I've spent years trying to make peace with what happened. I've rebuilt my life. Lucas has grown into a wonderful young man, and Mark has been there for both of us. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. I can see that. I saw you all together, and it's clear how happy you are. You deserve that, Helena. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Helena looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. I do forgive you, Thomas, she said softly. Not for you, but for me. Holding on to that pain, that anger, it wasn't helping anyone. And I'm in a different place now. I have a new life, but that doesn't mean the hurt just goes away. Her words were like a balm to his wounded soul, though they carried a bittersweet edge. She had moved on, truly moved on, and there was no place for him in her life anymore. He had known that deep down, but hearing it from her made it real. I don't expect anything from you, Thomas said, his voice hoarse. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and I wanted to hear you say that you're okay, that you're happy. Helena nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I am happy, Thomas. And I hope you can find some peace, too. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. It was a strange kind of closure, one filled with both forgiveness and finality. Thomas knew that Helena's life would continue without him, just as it had for all these years. And though it hurt, he accepted it. I should go, Helena said after a while, standing up. Take care of yourself, Thomas. Thomas watched as she turned to leave, her figure growing smaller as she walked back toward the hotel. He sat there for a long time after she was gone, the cool air nipping at his skin. He had come seeking forgiveness, and he had found it, but the emptiness inside him remained. As he stood up and began to walk away, Thomas realized that he still had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Helena walked away from Thomas, her heart a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The encounter had dredged up feelings she had long buried, but now, as she moved farther from him, she realized how much she had healed. The man she had once loved, the man she had built her life with, was now just a shadow from the past. He was no longer the center of her world, and for that, she was grateful. The city streets were bustling as Helena made her way back to the hotel. Mark and Lucas were probably wondering where she had gone, but she needed those few moments alone to process everything. Thomas's plea for forgiveness had been heartfelt, but it wasn't the words that struck her. It was the look in his eyes, the guilt, the regret, the weight of his mistakes. Helena knew those feelings well. She had carried them for years, thinking she had done something wrong. that she wasn't enough to keep him. But now she understood that Thomas's decisions had nothing to do with her. They had been his alone, and she had finally let go of the need to carry the burden of his choices. As she approached the hotel lobby, she spotted Lucas sitting with Mark by one of the large windows. They were laughing about something, their bond so natural, so real. It warmed her heart to see Lucas so happy, thriving in this life they had created together. Mark had stepped in, not to replace Thomas, but to fill the void that Thomas had left behind. He had been there for Lucas in ways that Helena could never fully express in words, and for that, she was endlessly grateful. When Lucas saw her, he jumped up, running toward her with that infectious energy only a young man like him could have. "Mama, where did you go? We were waiting for you." Helena smiled, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. "I just needed some fresh air, sweetheart," she said, glancing over at Mark, who was watching her with a knowing look. She could tell he sensed something was different, but he didn't ask. Mark always knew when to give her space. "You ready to head out?" Mark asked, standing up and stretching. "The concert hall's not far, but we don't want to be late." Helena nodded, smoothing a hand over Lucas's hair. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked through the city streets toward the concert hall, Helena felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation with Thomas had given her a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Forgiving him hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for him, but for her own peace. Holding on to that anger, that pain, had weighed her down for far too long. Mark walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers. She slipped her fingers into his, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. He had always been enough. From the moment he had come into her life, he had been the steady force she didn't realize she needed. Lucas walked ahead of them, his excitement about the evening bubbling over in every step. "Mama, I can't wait to see you perform tonight. Do you think there will be a lot of people there?" Helena smiled at his enthusiasm. "I think so, sweetheart. It's going to be a great night." The concert hall loomed ahead of them, its lights bright against the evening sky. As they stepped inside, Helena felt the familiar rush of nerves that always came before a performance. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was excitement. She was doing what she loved, and she had her family by her side. That was all that mattered. Backstage, as Helena prepared for the performance, she found a moment to herself, gazing into the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked calm, confident, and sure of herself. It was a far cry from the person she had been all those years ago when Thomas had walked out of her life. She had been broken then, unsure of her future, unsure of how she would survive. But now, she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. It was one of the stagehands, letting her know it was almost time. Helena took a deep breath, smoothing her dress before walking toward the stage. As she stepped out into the bright lights, the applause from the audience filled the hall, a hum of energy that settled her nerves. She took her seat at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, and for a brief moment she thought of Thomas. Not with anger or regret, but with compassion. He had been a part of her journey, a chapter in her life that had shaped who she was, but he was no longer the center of her story. This was her moment now, her future, her happiness. The first notes of her performance filled the air, and Helena lost herself in the music. It was as if the world outside the concert hall had faded away, leaving only the piano, the audience, and her. Every chord, every melody, flowed from her heart, carrying with it the emotions of the past and the hope of the future. As the final note echoed through the hall, the audience erupted in applause. Helena stood and bowed, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She glanced toward the front row, where Mark and Lucas were standing, clapping louder than anyone else. Her family, her home. After the concert, as people filtered out and congratulated her, Helena found herself smiling, not just because of the success of the performance, but because of the peace she had found within herself. She had forgiven Thomas, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the weight of the past. Later, as they walked back to their hotel, Lucas chattered excitedly about the concert, and Mark slipped his arm around Helena's waist. The night air was cool, but Helena felt warm, wrapped in the love of the people who mattered most to her. As they reached their room, Helena paused, taking in the quiet peace of the moment. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at Mark. "For what?" he asked, smiling. "For everything," she replied, leaning into him. "For helping me find my way back to myself." Mark kissed her forehead gently. "You did that all on your own, Helena. I was just lucky enough to be along for the ride." Helena smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had come so far, and the road ahead was still full of possibilities. But now, with her family by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The echo of Helena's voice stayed with Thomas long after their conversation ended. He had spent the night wandering the streets of New York, unsure of where to go or what to do. The forgiveness he had sought from Helena was bittersweet. It offered him relief. But at the same time, it underscored the reality of how much he had truly lost. He had been forgiven, yes, but he hadn't been welcomed back. There would be no reunion with the family he had abandoned. There was no way to undo the years of absence, no way to be a part of their lives again. The closure Helena had given him was real, but it also served as a final reminder that his past was behind him, locked away, and he had no place in her future. By the time Thomas reached his small apartment, the sun was already creeping over the skyline. The apartment was a far cry from the luxurious spaces he used to inhabit. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, and the silence was deafening. This was all he had now, the result of his ambition and greed. Once upon a time, he had everything, a family, a fortune, and a future full of possibilities. Now he had nothing but memories and regrets. As he stood by the small window, looking out over the city that had once felt like his playground, Thomas couldn't help but think about all the choices that had led him here. He had always believed that success was measured by wealth, by how many people admired you, by how much you could control. He had chased power, indulged in luxuries, and believed that the more he had, the happier he would be. But that illusion had shattered long ago. Thomas turned away from the window, sinking into the worn-out chair in the corner of the room. He had spent years running from his mistakes, pretending that they didn't matter, that he could outrun the consequences of abandoning his family. But now, sitting alone in this empty apartment, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Helena had moved on, built a new life, and found happiness with Mark and their children. Thomas had seen it in her eyes, in the way she had spoken to him with calm and certainty. She wasn't angry anymore. She had let go. But she had also made it clear that her new life didn't have room for him and Lucas. The thought of his son twisted a knife in Thomas's heart. He had barely recognized the young man who had stood beside Helena in the hotel lobby. Lucas had grown so much, and Thomas hadn't been there to witness any of it. He hadn't seen his son grow up, hadn't been there for birthdays, for milestones, for anything. The boy who had once idolized him now didn't even know him. Thomas had become a stranger in his own son's life. The guilt was crushing. Thomas had tried to ignore it for years, pushing it down, telling himself that he had made the right choice by pursuing a different life. But seeing Lucas again had shattered that delusion. He had abandoned his own child, and no amount of success or money could ever make up for that. But what hurt the most wasn't the realization of what he had lost. It was the understanding that he could never get it back. There was no second chance with Lucas. Even if he reached out, even if he tried to make amends, it would never be the same. He had missed too much, and Lucas had grown up without him. Thomas leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. How had he let it get this far? How had he become so blind to what really mattered? He had thought he was chasing happiness, but all along, he had been running from it. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to truly reflect on the man he had become. He had spent so long believing that power and wealth were the only things that mattered. But in the end, they had left him empty and alone. The success he had craved had come at the cost of the people he loved most. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. None of it had been worth it. Not the money, not the parties, not the prestige. He had traded everything that really mattered for a hollow life of luxury that had crumbled the moment things got tough. Thomas stood up, pacing the small room. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here drowning in regret. But what could he do? Helena had made it clear that their lives had diverged, and Lucas probably didn't even remember him. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He had to try. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could try to make peace with it. The next day, Thomas found himself standing outside a small cafe near Central Park, where Helena had once mentioned she liked to bring Lucas when they visited the city. It was a long shot, but he had no other plan. He didn't expect a warm reception. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Lucas would want to see him, but he had to try. As the hours passed, Thomas sat at one of the outdoor tables, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He watched the people pass by, families, couples, children laughing and playing in the park. Each face was a reminder of the life he had given up, the family he had lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw them. Helena, Mark, Lucas, and their younger child were walking toward the park, smiling and laughing together. Thomas's heart clenched at the sight. They looked so happy, so complete. He knew he didn't belong there, but something inside him urged him to stand up, to try. Helena spotted him first. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but then she gave him a small nod. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was permission to be there, even if he was no longer part of their lives. Lucas glanced over, his expression unreadable. Thomas's heart ached as he watched his son, now nearly a man, walk past without a word. But this time, it didn't crush him. This time, he understood. Lucas didn't owe him anything. He had built a life without his father, and Thomas had to accept that. But as Helena and her family continued walking, something shifted inside Thomas. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start by accepting the consequences. He had asked for forgiveness, and now he had to forgive himself, not for leaving, but for the years he had wasted running from the truth. Thomas stayed at the cafe until long after they were gone, the weight of his reflections settling over him like a quiet rain. He wasn't the man he used to be, and perhaps that was the most important step he could take, understanding that he had to change, and that redemption didn't come with a grand gesture, but with small steps. As he stood up and walked toward the park, the city alive with the sounds of life around him, Thomas felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Hope. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself reflecting more and more on his encounter with Helena and Lucas. The pain of seeing them happy without him still lingered, but it had also sparked something inside him, a desire to change, to rebuild his life from the ashes of his mistakes. He knew that redemption wouldn't come easily, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face the future rather than hide from it. He threw himself into his work at the hotel, no longer seeing it as a punishment, but as a chance to prove to himself that he could be more than the man who had lost everything. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and Thomas began to find a certain peace in the routine. Every day, he worked quietly and diligently, and though the other employees barely noticed him, he took pride in doing the job well. It wasn't just about earning a paycheck anymore. It was about rebuilding his sense of self-worth. For too long, Thomas had measured his value by his wealth and status. But now, he was learning that true worth came from within. He had spent so many years chasing after external validation, but now he was beginning to understand that the person he needed to prove something to was himself. One day, as Thomas finished his shift and headed out of the hotel, he felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. He had made peace with the fact that he couldn't go back, and now he was focused on moving forward, no matter how slowly. Walking through the streets of New York, he found himself wandering towards Central Park, a place that had become a sort of refuge for him in recent weeks. The park was alive with activity: families picnicking, children playing, people jogging along the paths. It was a reminder of the life that continued all around him, even as he rebuilt his own. As he reached a quiet bench near the edge of the park, Thomas sat down and gazed out at the people passing by. His thoughts drifted to Helena, to Lucas, and to the life he had lost. But instead of bitterness or regret, he felt a sense of acceptance. They had moved on, and so had he. Helena had forgiven him, and now it was time to forgive himself. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when someone approached the bench. It wasn't until the familiar sound of footsteps stopped in front of him that Thomas looked up, his breath catching in his throat. It was Lucas. The young man stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression cautious but not unkind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, he had no idea what to say. "Hi, Dad," Lucas said, his voice steady but hesitant. Thomas swallowed hard, the word "dad" hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. He hadn't heard Lucas call him that in so many years, and hearing it now after everything that had happened felt like both a gift and a reminder of all the time they had lost. "Hi, Lucas," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse. Lucas glanced down at the ground for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, he looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "I saw you at the cafe the other day. I didn't know if I should say anything, but I guess I just wanted to see if you were okay." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. Of all the things he had expected, this wasn't one of them. He had assumed that Lucas wouldn't want anything to do with him, that the distance between them was too great to bridge. But here he was, standing in front of him, offering something Thomas had never dared hope for: a chance. I'm trying to be," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I wasn't there for you, Lucas, and I can never make up for that, but I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Lucas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I spent a long time being angry at you," he said, his tone measured. "You left, and for a while I didn't understand why. I guess I still don't, not completely." Thomas opened his mouth to explain, but Lucas raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not asking you to explain it," he continued. "I've already made peace with it. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. I've seen how happy Mom is now, with Mark, with the life we've built. And I guess I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone, least of all me." Thomas felt a surge of emotion welling up inside him. He wanted to reach out, to tell Lucas how much he regretted every moment he had missed, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. All he could do was listen and hope that in some small way, they could find a way forward. "I don't expect anything from you," Lucas added, his voice softening. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Lucas. That means more to me than you'll ever know." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Thomas wanted to say so much more, to ask Lucas about his life, to find some way to reconnect, but he knew that this was a delicate moment, and he didn't want to push too hard. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas finally spoke again. "I'm meeting up with Mom and Mark soon," he said, glancing toward the park. "But maybe we can talk sometime. You know, catch up." Thomas's heart soared at the offer. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild the relationship he had lost with his son. "I'd like that," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd really like that." Lucas gave him a small smile, a gesture that felt like a lifeline in the midst of the storm that had been Thomas's life. Then, with a nod, he turned and walked toward the park, leaving Thomas standing there, watching him go. As Lucas disappeared into the crowd, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had been given a second chance, not just with Lucas, but with himself. It wasn't much, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he could breathe again. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Step by step, moment by moment, he would rebuild his life, no longer defined by the mistakes of his past, but by the hope of what could still be. As he walked away from the park, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Thomas smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet.